Excuse me. I want to look at a fairly brief scripture on Paul's visit to Athens. And I want to kind of look at the context of it, and so we'll see some pictures and things that illustrate just what he was seeing in Athens. So we'll start with kind of dividing the text in two pieces. First, if this will work. Dave, you may have to change these. The thing isn't seeming to work. No. Okay, to begin with, from Acts 17, 13 through 21. But when the Jews of Thessalonica found out that the word of God had been proclaimed by Paul in Berea also, they came there likewise, agitating and stirring up the crowds. And then immediately the brethren sent Paul out to go as far as the sea, and Silas and Timothy remained there. Now those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was beholding the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him, and some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seems to be proclaiming a strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. We want to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. So this is during Paul's second missionary journey, and he'd gone through a number of places in Asia and then up into Europe. And he had arrived at a place called Berea. And here's a little closer view where you can see better what's going on here. Well, he'd gotten some objections from a previous place, as we read there. And he was doing pretty well in Berea until some people came from the other community, Thessalonica, and complained there and stirred up the crowds. So they sent Paul on his way, and interestingly, it was just him. It wasn't Silas and Timothy. They let them stay. I guess they figured he was the leader, so they'd get him out of the way. So they sent him off, and it appears, we don't know for sure, but with the way the text's written, it appears that he probably didn't really intend to visit Athens. He went there just to get away from this place because it was close, and it was an easy sea journey, unlike some of those that he'd gone on where there were shipwrecks and things, because most of the route was sheltered because there was an island there next to the coast, and he went on a channel through that. In any event, he ended up in Athens and was looking around. He was on his own now. He didn't have his assistants with him, and Silas and Timothy. Well, he probably, they think, the text doesn't say, he probably landed at the port of Piraeus because that was the main port for Athens then and still is today. There are a couple other ports he might have used, and some scholars say maybe he went there, but most of them think he went to Piraeus. And there he would have walked into Athens. And along the way, he would have passed a lot of shrines. And a scholar named L.E. Wickerly says this: "There was one type of figure in particular which made it literally true that the whole city was seen to be full of idols. These were the Herms." Whoa. Square pillars surmounted by the head of Hermes. Many have been found in the Agora excavations. A particularly large accumulation stood at the northwest corner of the Agora. This was the main approach to the Agora by which Paul would probably enter as he came up from Piraeus. So there were a whole mess of these things, not to count all the others that he would have seen. Now, the Agora was the main marketplace, and this is how it looks today. It's being excavated. Excavation has been going on for a number of years. And it was, again, the main marketplace. There were crowds there. There were all sorts of things. There were shops, meeting halls, different things in there. And this is where Paul, when it says in the text here, that he reasoned with them in the marketplace, this is where the marketplace was. And this is a drawing of what it looked like at the time of Paul. Again, crowded with all kinds of buildings, and as we'll see a little bit later, then on the hills behind it, we have the Acropolis and Mars Hill. We'll point those out a little bit later. But there were all kinds of altars, and we'll take a quick look at a few of them that comes from a book that they sell at the museum there. Here's an altar called the Altar of the 12 Gods. I don't even know who all 12 of them were. The Sophistion, and this building still exists because it was later converted into a church, and so it's the only building from the Agora that still exists today and is not in ruins. And the Hephaestion was a temple for the god Hephaestos, which was the god of the forge. Nice looking guy, isn't he? This is the sanctuary of the mother of the gods. I mean, they had a whole ton of gods, so they had to have a mother for them. And this is the shrine for the mother of the gods. This is the Stoa of Zeus. Stoa is a large building surrounded by columns, and there were lots of stoas for different purposes, some of them for shops and things. This particular one is for the god Zeus, and it's the largest stoa that they have found remains of in the Agora. And here's someone making an offering at one of these shrines. Now, above the Agora was the Acropolis, and it was on that big hill in the back. And we'll take a quick look here at what that looked like. Now, that huge statue of Athena could be seen from far away. You go up a long flight of steps, it's still there, to get up to the Acropolis because it's a high plateau. And here's what it looked like in Paul's day, and there's that statue of Athena, and they say that ships at sea could see at least the top of that statue. It was so big. Now, the biggest temple on the Acropolis is the Parthenon, and that's what it looks today. They're doing some restoration work on it, as you can see. And in there was another huge statue of Athena. This one covered in gold foil. And she's holding a small statue of another god, and that was Nike. Nike was the goddess of victory and, of course, of running shoes. This is the Erechtheiad, and this is a temple that was dedicated to 3 major gods and a whole mess of minor ones. It's built on a hillside, and there was an entrance on each side, and each of those entrances led to shrines for a different god. And this is some of the things that Paul would have seen there. There again is that statue, which of course no longer exists. None of those statues do, but what we do have are these carvings on the walls, and they're still there. Well, here's some pictures of a few of them showing just a few of the gods. And these were the major ones, but there were many, many more. And these are carvings from that were over the entrance to the palace, and they were originally painted in bright colors, as you saw there in that depiction. So the Acropolis is still impressive today, even though it's not at all like it would have been originally when all those buildings were intact. Now, most of the Athenians believed, of course, in an immortal soul derived from Plato. And here's what one commentator writes. As a culture, Greeks were not interested in the resurrection of the body. They would have considered that an absurd notion. Following Plato, they thought of the body as a prison house of the soul, and death as a release from that prison. They were more interested in the immortality of the soul, except for the Epicureans, who did not believe in any kind of afterlife. We'll take a look at some of the funeral monuments that they had. There's a whole room in the Archaeological Museum devoted to funeral monuments, and this is a huge urn. And again, we'll play this one. The caption at the bottom of this exhibit, I'll read what it said as we look at this. Right. It says, Hermes Psychopompos, the leader of souls, leads a young woman to Hades. So that was the kind of belief that they had. Now, wealthy families had these huge grave markers carved. And here again, you see people look as if they're still alive because their people are still alive. Two common themes are shaking hands with a relative or having their servants, their maids, and assistants, whoever it might be. And here we have a mother shaking hands with her daughter. So again, very strong belief in immortality of the soul. Now, it says that they had Epicureans and Stoics. So who were these guys? Well, Epicurean, very quickly, I'll read something about that, again from a writer named Helmut Koester. It says, Epicureanism is a system of philosophy based on the teachings of Epicurus, founded around 307 BC. It teaches that the greatest good is to seek modest pleasures in order to attain a state of tranquility, freedom from fear, and absence from bodily pain. This combination of states is held to constitute happiness in its highest form. So these are people who believed in having fun, and originally they said in moderation, but later it became associated with just overdoing it and living for the moment. Epicureanism emphasizes the neutrality of the gods and their non-interference with human lives. It conceived the gods as blissful and immortal, yet inhabiting the empty spaces between worlds and the vastness of infinite space, too far away from the earth to have any interest in what man was doing. It rejected any possibility of an afterlife, while still contending that one should not fear death. So they did not believe, in this case, of immortal soul. They didn't believe in any kind of afterlife, and they were basically the only Athenian movement that I know of that would apply to. Now, Stoics, well, they got their name because they met in a stoa, one of these buildings with the columns along the side, and so they decided to call them Stoics, and they were founded by Zeno, who was born around 336 BC. It says, in theology, they were essentially pantheistic, God being regarded as a word soul. The only goal was to live in agreement with nature. They lacked the concept of a personal God. They were fatalists. They believed that everything that happens was fated to happen. They aimed for imperturbability as the ultimate virtue. They did share with Paul a belief in a creator God, but it was certainly not the same God that Paul believed in, because they also believed in that full pantheon of Greek gods. So they took Paul up to the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, and the way it got its name was And this tells you something about the gods too. Athenians believed that this was the seat of the first trial for murder of a son of Poseidon by the god of war Ares. So these gods killed each other, and they were capable of dying. And thus was named after this deity, Areopagus, the hill of Ares. And of course, in Latin, then Ares becomes Mars, so Mars Hill, meaning the same thing. Here in the past, the Council of Athens met to watch over the laws. It was the place where truth was established. And we'll take a look at how it looks today. Whoop. Well, there we go. Okay. Again, it's on a hill next to the Acropolis. Whoop. No. Okay. I see it from here. Well, may not be able to play this video, but there's a hill over to the right side of the Acropolis, and that was Mars Hill. And again, it's where here we go. It's where the council originally met. There it is on that rocky top. Here's a view of it from the Acropolis. And there's a plaque on the wall there that gives the text of Paul's sermon in Greek. The stairs to get up are cut right into the rock, and they're still there. These are the same stairs that Paul climbed, and they're kind of slippery. You have to be careful walking up. Here's what it looks like on top. Originally, there were a little courtyard there with some carved benches. Now, it's just rock because all that's deteriorated. And there's a view of the Acropolis from Mars Hill and down looking into the market area again from Mars Hill. Incidentally, the person on there who was speaking that we saw was, of course, not the Apostle Paul, because we didn't have video in those days. That was David Krogh reading from the text. Well, let's look now at the rest of the thing, and that is Paul's sermon, beginning with the 22nd verse, and we'll see how this applies to all these things we've been looking at. And Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, neither is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things." We'll stop just for a moment there to comment on some of this. To begin with, he's trying to soften them up a little bit. He says, well, I see you're religious in all things. The King James Version says very superstitious, but most scholars, and you could translate it either way. Most scholars think he probably meant religious because he wasn't trying to insult them at this point. He was trying to get them to listen to him, to put him on, an audience that will actually pay attention. So, the unknown God. Now, this was a very common inscription throughout the world at that time in these pantheistic societies. They didn't know all the gods. There were more of them than they could even imagine. So they'd stick up an altar just to be sure they didn't miss any of them. They haven't found the one from Athens yet, but they have found them in a lot of other locations, so we know that they were pretty common. And so this is a nice lead-in to say, okay, the unknown God, well, I'm going to tell you about him. Now you'll know who he is. Then, as I said, the Stoics believed in a creator God, so they'd be interested in hearing something more about this. So he had them on his side to begin with, at least, at that point. Again, the Epicureans did not believe that. They believed in the gods as being off somewhere else and not any relationship. So what he's saying essentially to them is, here's a God that actually is involved in human history. So he's reacting, and I'm sure he knew what those people believed. He was a well-educated person. Going on, he made from one every nation of mankind to live in all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitations, that they should seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. And again, he's contrasting with what the Epicureans say, that the gods are distant somewhere else and they don't really have anything to do with us. He's saying the real God is not distance. You can reach him. You can get to him. Then, interesting, he quotes from a couple of poets. He says, "For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring." Now, the original poems those come from, here's a little bit more of them. One of them by Epimedes says, "But thou art not dead, thou livest and abidest forever, for in thee we live and move and have our being." And in that poem he's referring to the god Zeus. And the other one by a writer named Aratus, "Never, O men, let us leave him unmentioned. All the ways are full of Zeus, and all meeting places of men. The sea and the harbors are full of him. In every direction we all have to do with Zeus, for we are also his offspring." Well, of course, notice he doesn't quote the part that says Zeus. He quotes the part that says we are his offspring. And again, what one commentator writes is this: he didn't quote these men because they were prophets or because their teaching was from God. He quoted them because these specific words reflected a biblical truth. And by using them, he could build a bridge to his pagan audience. So again, he's saying, you already believe in a God, in this case Zeus. You have your being. Well, I'm telling you, you do, except it's not Zeus. He doesn't say it quite like that, but of course, that's what he means. "Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all, everywhere, should repent, because he's fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead." So now he's moving on. He's tried to soften him up. He's got these things to explain a little bit who God is and what his relationship to humans is. And now he uses that word resurrection. And here's where he hit resistance. "Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer. But others said, 'We shall hear you again concerning this.' So Paul went out of their midst." Well, of course, when they say, "We'll hear you again," what it really means is we won't. It's just a polite way of saying, get out of here. We've heard what we want to hear. But what was the problem there? Well, of course, it was because of their belief in the immortal soul. And they didn't want anything that contradicted that. They're willing to listen to this other stuff about another God that they haven't heard of before, and about how he created the world and how he was close to mankind. But as soon as they hear resurrection, cross the line, and off they go. Continuing here, "But some men joined him and believed, among whom also was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." So he did convince a few, and of course we're sure that he would have talked to them more, that is, they're the ones who really did stay to listen more. We just don't have the text here in Acts to say what he said to them, because I'm sure they were not converted just by this one little bit of resurrection, but he would have spent more time with them and instructed them before they actually became converts. I'll read a couple other verses continuing in chapter 18. "After these things he left Athens and went to Corinth." Now, it doesn't say how long he stayed, but it implies there that after these events he went right on to Corinth. And he had sent messages to his assistants, his aides, to come to him as soon as they can. So the idea was he'd wait in Athens till they got there. What it appears is he'd had enough of Athens and he decided to get out of there. We don't know that for sure, but I would kind of imply that. So he probably sent messages to Timothy and Silas. Don't come to Athens, but go on to Corinth, which was another 50 miles or so to the west of Athens. And I think in doing this, he was kind of following Jesus' advice in Matthew 10:14 when he says, "And whoever does not receive you or heed your words, as you go out of that house or that city, shake off the dust of your feet." I really think that's what Paul was doing by heading on to Corinth. So, what can we learn from all this? Well, I think one thing that's important is how important emotion was in religion. These Athenians had grown up believing in this pantheon of gods. And they, more important than that, more important in terms of their rejecting Paul's message, that they believed in an immortal soul. And this comes down to an emotion. They'd always believed that. It's what they grew up with. And they hear something that contradicts it, they don't want to listen. Well, thing is, we encounter that today too. I mean, we don't have anybody today that sacrifices to the Greek gods, maybe Nike, at least when you buy your shoes. But we do have beliefs, and one of them is immortal soul, that same thing that the Greeks had dating back to Plato, that is a stumbling block when we try to talk to people. And we have that today, again, just as Paul would say, I see you are very religious, when you talk to somebody who believes in that. And they are very religious, but as soon as you try to contradict it, they don't want to listen. Same thing with Trinity. That's probably a bigger issue for a lot of people. As soon as you say you don't believe in the Trinity, you're a cult. That's it. Because they've grown up with it, even though it's not biblical, didn't originate until about 300 years, or 3rd century after Christ. Nevertheless, they don't know that. They simply know they have been taught this. Just a quick example. Years ago when I was in college, we didn't have one of our churches in Ann Arbor, or anywhere near there for that matter. And so I used to attend other churches just to hear what they had to say. And one of them I went to was a Methodist church, one of those huge ones that had 300 or 400 people in attendance. And the pastor gave a very interesting sermon about the unity of God, how there's only one God, and he went on and on and on about this. And I thought, this is something I could hear at our own church. It's great. Until he gets to the end and he said, now, I don't want you to think I'm contradicting the Trinity, because we're Trinitarians from way back. I thought, huh? Yeah. He's just given a sermon that proves there's no Trinity, but he says he still believes it because they're Trinitarians from way back. That's what he grew up with. Didn't want to change. Didn't want to listen to anything different, even though he understood unity of God as well as he did. So how can we apply this? Well, I'd say if we're talking to people from other churches and trying to convince them, follow Paul's example. Try and find common ground to begin with, like he did. To try and lead into what you want to say, but don't be surprised that you may hit a stone wall when you get to some of these issues, immortal soul, Trinity. And if you're rejected, don't take it personally, because that's the way things tend to be. But move on, talk to somebody else. Don't get mad, don't criticize them. Just accept that, because after all, that's what Paul did. He didn't despair. He moved on to Corinth, where he won a lot of converts. And of course, ultimately wrote a couple of letters to them. And our denomination's small. There's some other denominations around the world who also believe pretty much like we do, Christadelphians, among others. But add us all together, we're still small. But we shouldn't feel that that's a bad thing. And I'll conclude with this, from Matthew 7:13-14. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enters through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So we shouldn't feel bad about being a small group. Song.